You wake to the sound of steel being sharpened in the pre-dawn darkness of the Tower of London. It is May 19th, 1536 AD. The rhythmic scraping of wet stone against blade cuts through the morning mist like a death knell. Each stroke is deliberate, methodical, final. You are a once beloved Queen of England, and in less than 4 hours, that blade will sever your head from your shoulders. The stone walls of your cell seem to pulse with your heartbeat as you sit on the edge of your narrow bed. Your hands tremble not from the cold, but from the crushing weight of knowing. Beyond the small window, the carpenters hammer the scaffold together, the very platform where you will make your last appearance. Each strike of their mallets echoes through your chest, a grim countdown to oblivion that has been building for weeks. Your ladies-in-waiting move about the chamber like pale, drifting spirits. Their faces are drawn and colorless as they prepare you for the end. They dress you in a gray damask gown with a white chemise beneath, the colors of mourning and purity. You cannot help but notice the cruel irony. Henry himself chose these shades. Even in death, he seeks to control your image, clothing you not as the wronged wife, but as the repentant sinner. The air inside the tower is thick with the scent of river mud and human misery. Yet this morning, something else lingers, a metallic trace of fear, mingled with the faint sweetness of incense drifting from the chapel, where prayers rise for your soul. From the corridor, you hear the shuffle of armored feet and the low murmur of voices as guards take their places. The machinery of death is already in motion, and you are the centerpiece in this carefully choreographed horror. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. And please comment below to share where you're listening from. I find it remarkable that we can journey through these ancient moments together, across time and distance, bound by our shared curiosity about the past. The nightmare that would end with Anne Boleyn's execution did not begin with treason or adultery, but with Henry VIII's desperate need for a male heir and his growing obsession with Jane Seymour. By January of 1536, Anne had endured yet another miscarriage. This one was especially devastating, for it came on the very day Henry suffered a serious jousting accident, leaving him unconscious for 2 hours. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. As the king hovered between life and death, so too did Anne's hopes of securing her future through motherhood. The child lost was said to be male, a detail that would haunt Anne in her final months. Henry, who had once broken with Rome and torn England apart to marry her, now began to whisper that their union was cursed by God. The same theological arguments he had wielded to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon were now turned against Anne. The cruelty of it was unbearable. The very reasoning that had raised her to the throne would now destroy her. But Henry required more than divine displeasure to free himself from his queen. He needed legal grounds that would not taint his own judgment or challenge the legitimacy of their daughter Elizabeth. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's calculating chief minister, whose very survival depended on anticipating the king's desires, began weaving a case so elaborate and damning that it would not only ruin Anne, but erase any sympathy for her. The first thread Cromwell pulled was Anne's rumored connection with the court musician, Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was everything Henry was not: young, slender, dark-haired, and naturally charming. Women of the court delighted in his presence, and it was this very charm that Cromwell would twist into evidence. On April 30th, 1536, Smeaton was seized and taken to Cromwell's house in Stepney. There, he was subjected to an interrogation that almost certainly included torture, though the official records are silent on the precise methods. What we do know is this: Mark Smeaton, who had first denied any improper relationship with the Queen, emerged from Cromwell's questioning broken, his will shattered. Whatever words had been forced from his lips, they were not born of truth, but of agony. Yet, he confessed, not only to adultery with Anne, but to specific details so damning that they would become the backbone of Cromwell's case against her. His sudden change was the mark of a man broken by pain and terror, desperate to say anything to make the torment cease. With Smeaton's coerced confession secured, Cromwell wasted no time in weaving his web of conspirators. The first to be ensnared was Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool, and one of his closest and most trusted companions. On May 1st, during the bright May Day celebrations at Greenwich Palace, Norris was seized. The irony was impossible to ignore. On a day meant for spring, joy, and renewal, Cromwell turned it into a spectacle of betrayal and doom. For over a decade, Norris had been at Henry's side, sharing his most private moments and enjoying the king's trust. Now, that loyalty meant nothing. His alleged crime was not merely adultery with the queen, but treason itself, the betrayal of the very man who had raised him from minor nobility to a position of enormous power. Under interrogation, Norris refused to confess, his steadfast denials ringing either of genuine innocence or of the grim knowledge that confession meant certain death, regardless. William Brereton was next, dragged to the Tower on May 4th. A gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, Brereton owed his place at court to royal favor. His Welsh birth and modest background left him vulnerable, dependent upon Henry's goodwill. Like Norris, he was accused of adultery with Anne, but Cromwell added another, even darker accusation: conspiracy to murder the king. The tale was twisted to suggest that Anne would marry one of her lovers after Henry's death, ruling England through a puppet husband. The most shocking arrest came only a day later, on May 5th, when Sir Francis Weston, a man of barely 25, was taken. Recently married, with youth, wealth, and promise laid before him, Weston had no cause to risk everything for a queen's favor. His place in the alleged conspiracy stunned contemporaries. How could a man who had everything to live for gamble his future so recklessly? The charge was absurd, yet it mattered little. In Cromwell's scheme, Weston's very innocence was irrelevant. But it was the final arrest that revealed the true cruelty of Henry's court. On May 2nd, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, Anne's younger brother, was seized on the most monstrous of charges: incest with his own sister. The accusation was so depraved, so unspeakable, that it shattered any hope of sympathy for Anne. Even in a court as morally flexible as Tudor England, this was beyond belief. George, like Anne, was intelligent, cultured, and sharp-witted. His loyalty to his sister was unwavering, and it was precisely that loyalty which Henry perceived as a threat. Cromwell knew the power of such an accusation. By charging George with incest, he was not merely condemning him, but making it impossible for anyone to defend Anne without being tainted by association. The arrests came swiftly, each within a span of 5 days. This was no gradual uncovering of scandal, but a calculated demolition. The pace was deliberate, designed to prevent Anne's allies from mounting a defense, or even comprehending the enormity of what was unfolding. Anne herself was taken on May 2nd, shortly after returning from watching a tennis match at Greenwich Palace. She had spent those moments watching Henry play alongside Francis Weston, the very man who would, within days, be accused of being her lover. The cruelty of it was striking. Her final hours of freedom were spent in innocent amusement, even as the snare was closing around her. When the charges were read to her, it was not by Cromwell nor by Henry, but by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. A man whose fortunes had risen partly through the Boleyn family, now stood before Anne as the instrument of her destruction. In that moment, betrayal was not only political, but deeply personal. The pronouncement of her doom came from her own uncle. Norfolk's participation in Anne's destruction revealed the brutal calculus of Tudor politics, where family loyalty counted for nothing when weighed against royal favor and the instinct for personal survival. Witnesses left accounts of Anne's reaction to the charges, and together they paint the portrait of a woman struggling to grasp the enormity of what was being leveled against her. When she first heard of the adultery accusations, she reportedly laughed, not from amusement, but from the sheer absurdity of it. To imagine that she, a queen living under constant scrutiny where every glance and gesture was noted, could have conducted multiple secret affairs seemed so impossible that laughter was the only response left to her. Yet the laughter soon died in her throat. The full scope of the charges emerged like a tide, drowning her in accusations: adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, conspiracy to murder the king, schemes to marry a lover after Henry's death. It was no longer mere slander, but a total obliteration of her character, designed to strip her of every last shred of dignity and humanity. The journey from Greenwich Palace to the Tower of London was a cruel mirror of her past glory. Only 3 years earlier, she had ridden through those same streets during her coronation procession, hailed by crowds who cheered her name and rained flowers in her path. Now she was borne along in a guarded barge, the same people watching in silence, their faces grave, their cheers replaced by suspicion and judgment. The contrast must have been unbearable. To retrace her steps, not as a triumphant queen, but as a condemned prisoner. Upon reaching the tower, Anne was led into the very same royal apartments she had occupied before her coronation. It was a deliberate cruelty, forcing her to dwell among the tapestries and furnishings that had once celebrated her rise. The rooms that had been prepared for her triumph were now her prison, filled not with courtiers, but with shadows, guards, and the echo of impending death. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower, was ordered to record every word Anne spoke, every flicker of emotion she displayed. Kingston was no friend nor enemy, merely a bureaucrat whose survival depended on providing exactly what his superiors expected. His reports reveal a queen shifting between defiance and despair. At times, she maintained her innocence with regal poise, her dignity unshaken. At other moments, she broke, overwhelmed by fear and disbelief. What shines most through Kingston's accounts is Anne's inability or refusal to believe Henry would truly let her die. Again and again, she expressed faith that the king would spare her, that their shared past, their marriage, and their daughter would weigh upon him in the end. This was either a tragic misunderstanding of Henry's nature or a fragile act of denial, a shield her mind clung to against the impossible reality before her. Meanwhile, the trials of her alleged lovers began on May 12, 1536, at Westminster Hall. They were not trials in any honest sense, but theater, carefully staged to give the illusion of justice while masking the machinery of political murder. The evidence was flimsy: gifts from Anne, friendly conversations, mere presence at court events, twisted into opportunities for imagined misconduct. Still, the Crown's case rested on one cornerstone: Smeaton's confession. That fragile, coerced testimony, wrung from a musician of low birth who had everything to lose, became the foundation of the conspiracy. To risk all for an affair with the Queen was unbelievable, especially under the shadow of punishment so severe. Yet, his tortured words gave Cromwell exactly what he needed. Norris, Brereton, and Weston each stood firm, maintaining their innocence throughout. But in the theater of Tudor justice, innocence meant nothing. The verdict had been written before the trials began. The accused men refused to confess, even when offered the possibility of commuted sentences in exchange for false admissions of guilt. Their steadfastness in the face of certain death suggests either extraordinary courage or genuine innocence, or perhaps both. These were men with everything to live for, and nothing to gain from protecting a queen who was already marked for destruction. The trial of George Boleyn, held separately because of his noble rank, became the most dramatic of all. George, known for his eloquence and sharp legal mind, chose to defend himself. His performance in Westminster Hall was brilliant, so persuasive, so measured, that observers claimed the jury seemed moved by his arguments, even uncertain about his guilt. For a fleeting moment, it appeared that one of Anne's alleged conspirators might actually slip through Cromwell's carefully spun net. But George made a fatal mistake, one born either of naivete or of a desperate attempt to defend his sister's honor. When handed a written question, which he had been instructed to read silently, George instead read it aloud before the entire court. The question concerned Henry's alleged impotence, his inability to satisfy Anne as a wife. It was a revelation so explosive, so damaging to the king's pride, that George's fate was sealed on the spot, no matter the strength of his defense. The verdicts, in truth, had been decided long before the trials began. Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton were all declared guilty and sentenced to the full traitor's death, hanging, drawing, and quartering. George Boleyn, by virtue of his noble birth, was granted the mercy of beheading. The speed of the proceedings, the uniformity of the verdicts, all made clear that this was not justice, but political necessity dressed in legal costume. Henry's handling of the condemned revealed the cold precision of his cruelty. He commuted the commoners' sentences to simple beheading. This was paraded as an act of royal mercy, but in truth it was a calculation. By sparing them the brutal spectacle of hanging and quartering, he denied the people the possibility of pity for the condemned, ensuring that sympathy would not muddy the narrative of treason. On May 17, 1536, 5 men met their end on Tower Hill. Mark Smeaton, the musician whose broken confession had lit the spark, died still maintaining his guilt. Whether out of genuine remorse, a desperate bid to shield others, or simply the lingering scars of torture, Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston each proclaimed innocence to the last. Their final words preserved by careful witnesses who knew they were watching history unfold. The execution of George Boleyn was the most poignant of all. As Anne's brother and closest ally, his death was not merely the extinguishing of a life, but the collapse of an entire family's legacy. His last speech was remembered for its dignity and eloquence, as he protested his innocence with the same brilliance that had once made him a star at court. Meanwhile, confined within the tower, Anne could not escape the sounds of death outside her window. The gathering of the crowd, the roar of voices, the heavy thud of the axe, the chilling cheers of spectators eager for blood. Each sound would have struck her like a blade of its own, the knowledge that men had been executed because of her alleged sins. Sins she knew were either twisted from lies or conjured entirely. Must have been almost unbearable. Henry, in his characteristic coldness, had already moved on. Even before Anne's trial began, he was preparing for marriage to Jane Seymour. Jane, pale and soft-spoken, represented the very opposite of Anne. Where Anne had been dark, passionate, and intellectually formidable, Jane was fair, submissive, and content to serve as a pliant ornament to the crown. Anne's own trial was set for May 15th, 1536, within the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The choice of location was deliberate. By holding the proceedings inside the tower, Henry ensured the trial would unfold under heavy guard, beyond the reach of public voices, and safe from any demonstrations of sympathy that might have erupted in the open streets. The trial of Anne Boleyn was staged under the looming shadow of the Tower of London, an unmistakable reminder that mercy would not be part of her fate. By holding the proceedings within the very fortress where she was imprisoned, Henry ensured there would be no public outcry, no chance for sympathetic demonstrations. Every detail was calculated to crush her spirit before judgment was even spoken. Anne entered the great hall dressed in black, her gown flowing around her like a river of mourning. The choice of color was deliberate, a visual symbol of her fall from glory. Only a few years earlier, she had walked these halls as queen, radiant in jewels and fine silks. Now, she stood as a prisoner, accused of crimes so monstrous they seemed impossible to comprehend. Her ladies-in-waiting walked at her side not only as comfort, but as witnesses, charged with recording her behavior to ensure no gesture or word went unnoticed. Presiding over the trial was Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle. The sight of him seated in judgment was perhaps the cruelest stroke of all, a reminder of the merciless nature of Tudor politics. In this world, family meant nothing when set against the demands of royal favor and personal survival. Norfolk's expression revealed no trace of compassion as the charges were read aloud. The accusations were precise, each one tied to specific dates and places. Anne was charged with adultery with Henry Norris on October 6, 1533, at Westminster Palace, with William Brereton on November 8th of that same year, with Mark Smeaton on April 26, 1536, and with Francis Weston on May 20th, 1534. The precision of these dates was intended to strengthen the illusion of truth, but in their very perfection lay proof of their falsehood. Life at court was lived under constant scrutiny. Such secret liaisons at such convenient intervals were nearly impossible. Even more shocking was the charge of incest with her brother, George, allegedly committed on November 2nd, 1535, months after Anne had miscarried her last child. The accusation defied both logic and decency, yet it was weaponized to paint Anne as depraved beyond redemption. The most damning of all, however, was the charge of treason. Anne was accused of conspiring to imagine and compass the king's death, and of promising to marry one of her supposed lovers after Henry's demise. This was the accusation that truly sealed her fate, for treason was not a matter of private sin, but a crime against the crown itself. Without it, her alleged affairs could have been dismissed as moral failings. With it, she was cast as a direct threat to the very stability of England. Throughout the recitation of charges, Anne maintained her composure. Witnesses described her as serene, her face bearing the dignity of a queen, even as the words sought to strip her of that title. When at last she was allowed to respond, she denied every charge with clarity and force, her voice unwavering even in the face of enemies. Those present could not help but note her courage, even if her fate had already been written. But courage alone could not save her. The legal system of Tudor England offered her little defense. She could not summon witnesses in her favor, nor question her accusers, nor rely on legal counsel. The trial was a pageant, its outcome decided before she ever set foot in the hall. The evidence presented was flimsy, built on whispers and speculation. Servants and courtiers spoke of glances exchanged, private conversations overheard, small tokens given as gifts. Nothing concrete, yet all twisted into a tapestry of guilt. The most damning came from Lady Wingfield, who had died before the trial and thus could not be questioned. She was said to have confessed knowledge of Anne's misconduct, though no one could clearly explain what that knowledge was. Even the dead were made to testify against her, a grim testament to the prosecution's desperation. And through it all, the trial moved with breathtaking speed. Events that should have demanded weeks of careful examination were swept through in mere hours. The machinery of justice had been reduced to spectacle, with Anne forced to play the starring role in a tragedy written by others. The hall that had once echoed with her triumphs now bore witness to her destruction. Each word spoken was another stone laid on the path to her doom. And still she stood tall, clinging to the only thing left to her unshakable claim of innocence. The swiftness of Anne Boleyn's trial was astonishing, even by the ruthless standards of Tudor England. In a single day, the case was presented, debated, and concluded. The evidence had hardly been weighed, her defense scarcely heard, before the machinery of judgment moved forward with relentless speed. This haste revealed Henry's urgency, not only his eagerness to rid himself of Anne, but his impatience to marry Jane Seymour and secure his future. Every moment was designed to silence sympathy, to prevent public opinion from rising in Anne's favor. When the jury of 26 peers retired to consider their verdict, few doubted what would follow. These men were bound to Henry by loyalty, ambition, and fear. Some had once been Anne's allies, men who had risen alongside her, but now their survival depended on condemning the very woman they had once praised as queen. Their silence, their obedience, was their own form of self-preservation. The verdict was delivered by Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle. Observers noted that his voice trembled. whether from sorrow or from the relief of finishing an unbearable duty. To stand in judgment of his own niece, to pronounce her fate before the eyes of England, was a cruel irony. Yet Norfolk, like all others, was trapped by the brutal demands of politics. His duty to the crown outweighed his blood ties. The sentence was death. Anne was to be burned at the stake, the traditional punishment for women convicted of treason, or beheaded at the king's mercy. The offer of beheading was described as an act of royal grace, sparing her the horrific agony of fire. But even this so-called mercy was steeped in cruelty, for it kept Anne's life dangling in uncertainty, her fate resting not in law, but in Henry's whim. Those present never forgot Anne's reaction. She heard her doom with calm composure, her royal dignity unshaken. Her voice rang through the hall as she prayed that God would save the king, a declaration that startled even her enemies. She ended with a clear protestation of innocence, her words echoing with such conviction that for a moment the weight of the hall shifted. Some whispered that even in chains, she spoke more like a queen than those who had condemned her. Yet the strength she displayed in public faltered behind closed doors. Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, recorded her private moments, revealing the depth of her torment. With her ladies in attendance, Anne swung between hope and despair, her emotions shifting like waves against the shore. One moment she clung to faith, certain Henry would remember their love and show mercy. The next, terror consumed her, as the reality of the executioner's blade pressed upon her mind. It is possible that this hope was more than love. It was a shield. To believe Henry might spare her was perhaps the only way she could endure the waiting. To accept the truth that her husband, the man she had once risked everything for, had abandoned her utterly, might have shattered her spirit before the axe could fall. Historians have wrestled for centuries with the question of her guilt. The case against her was built on sand, supported by testimony from those whose lives depended on Henry's favor. The cornerstone of the prosecution was the confession of Mark Smeaton, the court musician, a confession almost certainly extracted under torture. Even in Tudor England, such evidence was unreliable at best, convenient at worst. The dates cited in her charges raised further doubts. Records reveal that during several of the alleged affairs, Anne was either pregnant or recovering from childbirth. The demands of her role as queen, the constant watchful eyes of the court, and her fragile health made the possibility of multiple secret lovers nearly impossible. The accusations read more like a carefully constructed story than truth. The speed of the investigation, the haste of the trials, and the uniformity of the verdicts all point to one conclusion. Anne's fate had been sealed long before she stood in the Great Hall. This was not justice. It was a performance, a political execution dressed in the robes of law. And at its center stood a woman who, despite her flaws, faced her destruction with a courage that history would never forget. The efficiency with which Cromwell and his allies built the case against Anne Boleyn was nothing short of remarkable. But it raises a haunting question. Was the evidence truly discovered, or was it manufactured to suit the king's will? What stands out most is that none of Anne's alleged lovers, except for the tortured Mark Smeaton, confessed to their crimes. Even when promised the possibility of lesser punishments, they refused. These were men staring death in the face, men who would have had every reason to admit guilt if it might save them. Yet, they chose silence, clinging to their innocence to the very end. Their defiance casts a long shadow of doubt over the accusations that condemned them. The political context of Anne's fall tells an even clearer story. By 1536, Henry VIII was desperate for a son. Anne's tragic miscarriage in January had ended his hopes that she might give him the male heir he craved. From that moment, she ceased to be an asset and became an obstacle, standing between Henry and Jane Seymour, the gentle, fair woman he had already begun to court. Henry had once broken England away from Rome to claim Anne as his wife. Now, with the same ruthless determination, he was prepared to destroy her. Henry's character left little room for doubt. He was a man who eliminated anyone who stood in his path, be they wife, ally, or political foe. His passion for Anne had once been unstoppable, and so too was his cruelty in discarding her. The same fire that had raised her to a throne now fueled her destruction. Yet the question of Anne's guilt cannot be confined to charges of treason and adultery. It touches on her very character. She was intelligent, ambitious, and politically astute, but she was also quick-tempered, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to speak her mind. In a world where queens were expected to be submissive ornaments, Anne's wit and independence marked her as dangerous. Her enemies at court, many of whom had despised her treatment of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary, were eager to see her fall. Every sarcastic remark, every bold challenge to Henry's authority now returned to haunt her, painted not as strength but as arrogance. Her close relationship with her brother George Boleyn added another layer of suspicion. There was no credible evidence to support the monstrous charge of incest. Their intimacy was nothing more than the loyalty of siblings bound tightly in the deadly world of Tudor politics. But to those searching for scandal, their bond became fodder for slander, and Cromwell twisted it into a crime that shocked the nation. As Anne sat imprisoned in the Tower, Henry was already erasing her. On May 14th, the day before her trial, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to Lambeth Palace. There, Henry made his confession and sought to have his marriage to Anne declared null and void. The speed of the proceeding revealed his urgency. He could not wait to rid himself of her. The annulment was based on the same twisted theological argument he had used to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, that the union had never been valid in God's eyes. This time, Henry cited his past relationship with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, as an impediment that made his marriage to Anne incestuous from the start. The irony was almost unbearable. Henry claimed Anne was guilty of adultery within their marriage, while simultaneously insisting that no true marriage had ever existed between them. The contradiction mattered little. What mattered was convenience, erasing Anne's queenship with a stroke of the pen. For Anne, the psychological blow was devastating. In a single moment, she was stripped not only of her crown, but of her very identity. She was no longer Queen of England. She was a woman who had lived in sin with the king, and her daughter, Elizabeth, once the bright promise of the Tudor dynasty, was branded illegitimate. This was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. To lose her crown was one thing, but to see her child's future shattered, her legitimacy destroyed, was a pain no mother could bear lightly. Anne had fought with every ounce of strength to secure her daughter's place in history. Now, Henry sought to erase them both. The woman who had once been triumphant, cheered through the streets of London as England's queen, now sat in the Tower, abandoned and betrayed, watching as her life, her marriage, and her legacy were dismantled piece by piece. Anne's entire world had been reduced to a few small, dimly lit chambers within the Tower of London. Everything she had once been, a crowned queen, a beloved wife, and the mother of England's hope for the future, was now dismissed as meaningless. Her marriage declared null, her daughter branded illegitimate, and her very existence reduced to that of a condemned woman awaiting her fate. Preparations for her execution moved forward with a precision that felt almost mechanical, each step carried out with the grim efficiency that characterized the Tudor administration. Henry had made a decision that shocked many. Anne would not die by the traditional English axe, but instead by the sword, a method foreign to England. The swordsman was summoned from Calais, chosen specifically for his reputation as a master of his craft. The French technique was considered cleaner, quicker, and less brutal than the English axe. The choice, however, carried deeper meaning. By using a foreign executioner, Henry could distance himself from the act, making Anne's death appear as a matter of legal formality rather than his personal vengeance. It was also a way to ensure that no English executioner, possibly swayed by pity for the Queen, would falter in carrying out the task. The very presence of this foreigner, this silent man of deadly precision, added an eerie air of sophistication to what was, at its heart, a brutal act of destruction. The executioner's weapon became a subject of whispered fascination among those within the tower. Unlike the heavy axe, blunt and unforgiving, the sword was sleek, sharp, and designed for precision. Its presence remained hidden until the final moment, a secret blade waiting to sever the fragile thread of Anne's life. Its invisibility only heightened the tension, for Anne and those around her lived under the constant knowledge of what lay ahead without ever seeing the weapon that would carry it out. Through all this, Anne fought to preserve her dignity. Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, recorded her shifting moods. At times she appeared calm and resolute, speaking of her innocence and her trust in God's judgment. At other times, despair overtook her, and tears flowed freely as the reality of her fate pressed down upon her. These swings between confidence and terror revealed the cruel psychological torment she endured in her final days. But nothing pained her more than the thought of her daughter, Elizabeth. Barely 3 years old, the little girl could not possibly understand what was happening to her mother. Anne's heart ached at the knowledge that Elizabeth would not only grow up without her, but would also be branded illegitimate, her future uncertain. Anne pleaded for one last chance to see her child, but her request was coldly denied. That loss, sharper than any sword, was perhaps the deepest cruelty of all. Her ladies-in-waiting, once eager competitors for the honor of serving their queen, now served a different role. They were both her comfort and her watchers, tending to her in her last hours while being careful to guard their own positions at court. They wept with her in private moments, but also knew their every action would be judged by those in power once Anne was gone. The night before her death, Anne prayed for hours, kneeling until her legs grew weak. Her words carried both sorrow and strength, as if she were already preparing her soul for God's judgment. She had come to accept that Henry would not grant mercy, and that her death was inevitable. Yet even in those final hours, she considered her duty as queen. She spoke with her ladies about what she would wear, how she should hold herself, and the composure she must maintain. For Anne knew that even her execution would be a performance. The world would be watching, and her last moments would leave an impression that could not be undone. When dawn broke on May 19th, 1536, the sky was heavy with gray mist, the damp chill of the morning seeping into the stone walls of the tower. Anne rose early, having slept little, and prepared herself with deliberate care. She dressed in a dark gray damask gown, with a white chemise beneath. The somber gray spoke of mourning, while the white suggested innocence and purity. This choice, subtle yet powerful, was Anne's final statement to those who would witness her death. Anne's choice of clothing that morning carried a silent message. The white of her chemise was her last declaration of innocence, while the gray of her gown was her acceptance of the death that awaited her. Her hair, once her crowning glory, and the very feature that had first captured Henry's attention, was arranged simply and covered by a modest white coif. The practical purpose of this detail was undeniable. It would allow the executioner an easier task, but it also stripped away the last trace of vanity from a woman who had once dazzled Europe with her beauty. She was no longer preparing for a courtly occasion, but for death itself. Her final meal was plain, just bread and wine. She ate not from hunger, but from ritual, the breaking of bread serving as a final communion with life before she surrendered herself to whatever lay beyond. Food, once a pleasure in courtly feasts, had no meaning now. Only the symbolism mattered. From her chamber, Anne could hear the grim activity outside. Workmen tested the scaffold with heavy steps, ensuring its stability. Straw was carefully laid, meant to catch her blood and shield the earth beneath. The sounds of hammering and shuffling drifted through her window, like reminders that every detail of her death had been arranged with the same cold efficiency that had once organized her coronation. By mid-morning, the crowd had begun to gather. Tower Green filled with people from every walk of life, all drawn to the unprecedented spectacle of a queen's execution. Public executions were hardly unusual in Tudor England, but the death of a crowned queen was extraordinary, a moment in history that none present would forget. Among the sea of faces stood courtiers who had once sought her favor, merchants who had thrived under her patronage, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn. Some came from duty, others from curiosity, and still others from the darker fascination of watching a life end before their eyes. When Sir William Kingston entered her chamber, the weight of his duty was clear in his face. His tone was respectful, but his message firm. The time had come. He was there not merely to escort her, but to ensure that justice, as defined by the crown, was carried out. Anne rose gracefully, straightened her gown, and declared her readiness to face what lay ahead. There was no trace of panic in her voice. Those present would later marvel at her composure. The walk from her chambers to the scaffold was the longest journey of her life. Each step echoed in her mind, each stone beneath her feet a reminder of how swiftly fortune can change. She passed through courtyards where she had once walked as queen, where nobles had bowed and courtiers had whispered her name with admiration. Now, those same stones bore witness to her fall. The tower, which had once served as her palace during her coronation, now stood as the fortress of her destruction. When Anne emerged into Tower Green, silence fell across the gathered crowd. The spectacle before them was unlike any in living memory, a queen walking calmly to her own execution. Those who had expected her to collapse, to weep uncontrollably, found themselves instead watching a woman of quiet dignity. She carried herself with the poise of a queen, even stripped of her crown, even condemned. The scaffold itself was stark and unadorned. A low wooden platform, raised only a few feet above the earth, it lacked the grand elevation often given to traitors. This was not a spectacle designed to be seen from miles away, but a more intimate stage, as if her final performance would be witnessed not by the world at large, but by the few who mattered most in this moment of history. There was a subtle acknowledgement here, perhaps, that she was still a queen, even as the law denied her that title. The executioner was already waiting upon the scaffold, his presence as chilling as the mist that hung over Tower Green. He wore foreign garb, unfamiliar to English eyes, and a black hood that concealed his expression. At his feet lay a simple block of wood, and beneath the straw covering, hidden from view, rested the sword that would end Anne's life. He stood motionless, a silent figure of fate, as if carved from shadow itself. Anne mounted the scaffold with steady steps, supported by her ladies who had been permitted to attend her in these last moments. Though the wooden platform was low and unadorned, her ascent seemed monumental, as though she were climbing not toward death, but toward eternity. When she turned to face the crowd, silence fell over the gathering. Every eye was fixed upon her. Custom demanded that a condemned traitor speak before death, and Anne did not shy from this duty. Her words, recorded in varying accounts, carried the same essence: loyalty to the king, acceptance of the judgment against her, and a humble request for prayers for her soul. She did not proclaim her innocence directly, nor did she curse Henry or the court that had betrayed her. Whether her restraint came from calculation, exhaustion, or a final act of love to protect her daughter, Elizabeth remains forever uncertain. What is known is that her words carried dignity, humility, and a quiet strength that silenced even her enemies. When she had finished, Anne calmly removed her headdress and jewelry, handing them to her ladies with careful precision. Each gesture stripped away another fragment of her royal identity, leaving her not as the Queen of England, but simply as Anne Boleyn, a woman preparing to meet her end. Then, with trembling hands, Her ladies bound her eyes with a white cloth. The blindfold was a final mercy, sparing her the sight of the blade and ensuring her stillness. Anne knelt gracefully beside the block, her posture upright, her bearing regal even now. Those who watched saw not a broken woman, but a queen to the very last breath. Her ladies wept openly, but Anne remained calm, her lips moving silently in prayer. The executioner stepped forward at last. His sword, now revealed, gleamed in the pale morning light, long, slender, and sharp, so unlike the heavy English axe. Designed for precision, it carried with it an air of foreign sophistication and a chilling promise of swiftness. He positioned himself carefully, waiting for the perfect moment, while Anne knelt motionless, blindfolded, and serene. Then, in one fluid motion, the sword flashed downward. It was so swift that many in the crowd barely saw it. In a heartbeat, Anne's head was severed cleanly from her body. There was no scream, no struggle, only silence. For one breath she was alive, and in the next, she was gone. A stunned hush swept over Tower Green. The crowd stood frozen, the reality of what they had witnessed pressing upon them with the weight of history. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers for her soul. Others murmured in disbelief, their voices hushed as though afraid to disturb the air. The executioner's efficiency had been both mercy and horror, sparing Anne the prolonged agony of the axe, yet leaving the crowd with the shocking finality of her sudden death. Anne's ladies, tears streaming down their faces, moved forward immediately. With trembling devotion, they wrapped her remains with care, gathering both body and severed head as if each act of tenderness might restore some fragment of dignity. Their grief echoed the grief of a nation that had just witnessed the unimaginable, the execution of its queen. Anne's body was wrapped in white cloth, with the tenderness of women preparing a beloved friend for burial. Her ladies handled her remains with trembling hands, their tears falling freely as they performed this last act of loyalty. Their grief was raw and unrestrained, a grief born not only of devotion but of helplessness, for they had walked beside Anne through her rise and now through her fall. To them, she was not only a queen, but a woman of strength, intelligence, and warmth, unjustly silenced. The crowd that had gathered for the spectacle began to scatter almost immediately after the execution. There was no cheering, no triumphant murmur, only uneasy whispers and hurried footsteps. It was as though the weight of what they had witnessed pressed too heavily on their souls. The execution of a crowned queen, chosen by a king and anointed with sacred ceremony, had unsettled something deep within them. They felt as if they had participated in an act that stretched beyond justice, shaking the very foundations of royal authority and divine right. Yet, while England mourned in hushed silence, Henry VIII wasted no time. Within hours of Anne's death, his heart and mind had shifted entirely. By May 30th, 1536, only 11 days after Anne's beheading, Henry married Jane Seymour in a private ceremony. The speed of the union spoke volumes. It revealed his desperate desire to erase Anne's memory, to sweep away the scandal, and to begin again with a wife he believed would be compliant, gentle, and yielding. Jane Seymour was everything Anne had not been: cautious, soft-spoken, and unlikely to challenge Henry's authority. But despite the king's determination to bury Anne's memory, she could not be erased. Her daughter Elizabeth, declared illegitimate and stripped of status, survived. That child, small and vulnerable in 1536, would one day rise to become Elizabeth I, one of the most remarkable monarchs in England's history. Ironically, the daughter of the disgraced queen became the very embodiment of the greatness Henry had so desperately sought through a son. Through Elizabeth, Anne lived on, her legacy defying Henry's attempt to destroy her name. The men who had perished with Anne, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and George Boleyn, faded into the margins of history. They were remembered chiefly in connection with Anne's downfall, their names tied to hers in scandal and sacrifice. Their deaths were a warning to all who might dare to rise too close to royal favor or to stand in opposition to Henry's will. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne's ruin, thrived for a time, serving Henry with ruthless efficiency. Yet, his loyalty bought him no safety. In 1540, just 4 years after orchestrating Anne's fall, Cromwell himself would face the same scaffold, another victim of the king's shifting desires. His fate underscored the brutal truth. In Henry's court, no one was indispensable, and every servant was expendable when the king's will turned. Questions of Anne's guilt lingered long after her death. Some, like Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, whispered doubts about the justice of her execution, haunted by private misgivings. Others, such as the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, maintained a rigid public defense of the verdict, though whispers suggested that even he harbored unease at the blood that stained his hands. The execution of Anne Boleyn set a dangerous precedent. It revealed Henry as a monarch unbound by restraint, willing to destroy even a crowned queen to satisfy his hunger for control and his longing for a male heir. The Renaissance prince, once admired for his learning and charm, was now seen as a tyrant whose ruthlessness eclipsed his earlier virtues. Beyond England, the reaction was one of horror. Across Europe, Catholic courts condemned Henry as a monster who had slain his own wife for the sake of lust and ambition. Already scandalized by his break with Rome, they now viewed him as a dangerous figure, willing to shatter the sanctity of marriage and throne alike. England's reputation suffered, and Henry's actions deepened the nation's isolation from Catholic Europe. But behind the politics and the judgments, the greatest tragedy was human. A woman who had once held the second highest place in the land, crowned, honored, and adored, was reduced to a body on a scaffold. Her life ended not by fate, but by the will of the man she had loved and served. Anne Boleyn's downfall was not only the destruction of a queen, but a reminder of the peril faced by those who dared to stand too close to absolute power. The Tower of London stood silent after that day, its ancient stones absorbing yet another layer of sorrow. It would host many more tragedies, yet none would echo with the same haunting weight as the gray May morning of 1536. Anne's burial was stripped of ceremony, carried out quietly within the walls of the tower. But her story lingered in whispers, in the memories of those who had witnessed her courage, and in the legacy of her daughter, who would one day sit on the very throne Anne had once dreamed of securing. Anne's burial was as hurried and undignified as her trial had been. Her remains were placed not in a coffin befitting a queen, but in an old elm chest that had once held bow staves. Within that humble container, she was lowered into the ground, interred in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower grounds. There was no elaborate funeral, no procession of mourning courtiers, no monument to mark her resting place. For a woman who had once worn the crown of England, her end was painfully stark, stripped of all ceremony. The irony of her burial place was piercing. She was laid to rest beside others who had fallen victim to Henry's justice, her own brother George among them, as well as the men condemned as her alleged lovers. The chapel became a silent gathering of the broken, its stones heavy with the memory of ambition crushed beneath royal will. St. Peter ad Vincula stood not as a shrine of peace, but as a tomb of warnings, each grave a reminder of the peril of drawing too close to the fire of power. At court, the days following Anne's death carried a chilling normalcy that bordered on cruelty. The courtiers who had once vied for her attention now eagerly bent their knees before Jane Seymour, offering flattery as though Anne had never existed. The machinery of government rolled on, steady and unbothered, as if the execution of a queen were no more than a bureaucratic matter, completed with cold efficiency. Yet beneath the polished surface, the trauma lingered. Those who had seen Anne kneel upon the scaffold could not so easily banish her image. The memory of the blindfold, the whisper of prayer on her lips, and the single swift stroke haunted their thoughts. For many, it would never fade. Henry himself revealed little of his inner state. Contemporary reports describe a man unshaken, seemingly without regret. He cast himself into his new marriage with Jane Seymour as if Anne had never been. But his actions betrayed him. The speed with which he erased Anne from both public record and private memory was telling. Her portraits were taken down from the walls where they had once been proudly displayed. The intertwined initials H and A, once carved into palace stone, were chipped away. Her coat of arms was stripped from its places of honor, replaced with Jane's. Henry sought to excise Anne's presence from the very bones of his realm, as though her existence itself had been a mistake that he could correct by erasure. Yet history does not yield so easily to the will of kings. Anne's story endured in the whispers of courtiers, in the private recollections of those who had loved her, and in the legacy of her daughter. Even as Henry strove to blot her out, she became something larger than life, a symbol of ambition, of love, of the peril of defying order. The very attempt to destroy her memory only deepened her legend. Her death marked a turning point in Henry's reign and in the history of England. It revealed a monarchy, unrestrained, willing to destroy even a consecrated queen to satisfy desire and secure obedience. It set a precedent that cast its shadow over every wife who followed and every rival who dared to challenge the crown. Anne, who had once reshaped the religion of a nation, was reduced to a cautionary tale, her brilliance recast as dangerous pride, her courage interpreted as reckless folly. As the sun sank on May 19, 1536, the Tower of London fell into an uneasy silence. The scaffold had been dismantled, the crowds dispersed, and the bloodstains washed away. But the echoes of the morning could not be erased so swiftly. They lingered in the minds of all who had seen the blade fall. They linger still in history. Anne Boleyn, who had risen higher than most, dared to dream, and who had fought fiercely for her place beside a king, lay now in the quiet of St. Peter's Chapel. The steel that had been sharpened with such care had done its work, silencing her voice forever. Her struggles, her triumphs, her torment, all ended in a chest of elm, buried without honor, but destined never to be forgotten. Anne Boleyn had once commanded the attention of kings and shifted the very course of nations. Yet as the May evening deepened into shadow, the tower guards resumed their silent rounds, and the Thames lapped softly against the fortress walls. Her presence seemed to linger. The ghost of Anne began its long haunting of English history that night. Though Henry had tried to erase her from memory, she would not vanish so easily. The woman who had been condemned, silenced, and buried without honor continued to live in whispered recollections. She survived in the doubts of those who questioned her guilt, and in the legend of a queen who dared to stand against a king's will and paid for her defiance with her life. Her voice, though stilled by steel, echoed in the corridors of time, refusing to be silenced by decree or chiseling hands that scraped away her initials. The sound of steel being sharpened had marked the beginning of her final mourning. But it was the silence after her death that revealed the greater tragedy. In that silence lay more than the loss of one woman. It carried the weight of shattered futures, broken promises, and the destruction of hope. Her fall was not merely the end of a queen, it was the erasure of possibilities, the possibility of a different reign, of a different path for England, of a world shaped by her influence rather than her absence. Anne's execution revealed the triumph of fear over courage, of ruthless ambition over human compassion. It stood as one of the darkest pages in the long, blood-soaked story of the English crown. A chapter where justice bowed to power and love was devoured by suspicion and betrayal. In the stillness of that night, the true horror of her death revealed itself, not only in the severing of a life, but in the cruel extinguishing of potential. The queen who had risen like a comet, dazzling and dangerous, now lay in a chest beneath cold stone. Yet the memory of Anne Boleyn, The woman, the mother, the queen, would never rest as quietly as her body. Her ghost walked through history, unforgotten, unresolved, forever a reminder of what power can destroy and of what courage dares to endure.